April 2026. U.S. forces are striking targets inside Iran. They have stealth fighters. They have bombers. They have drones. And yet, the aircraft they keep sending in is a slow, ugly, 50-year-old jet that Washington has been trying to retire since 1984. One of those jets took a hit over Iranian airspace. It was badly damaged. It should have gone down. Instead, it flew all the way to Kuwait before the pilot ejected safely. That jet is the A-10 Warthog. And the Airforce just announced it will keep flying until 2030. The Warthog has no stealth. It has no supercruise. It is not invisible to radar. By every metric that modern air power is measured by, it should be obsolete. And yet war after war, decade after decade, when soldiers on the ground need someone overhead, this is the aircraft commanders reach for first. Why? That answer starts with a gun. And not just any gun. The gun that ate the airplane. Most aircraft get designed first, then someone figures out what weapons to hang on it. The A-10 did this completely backwards. Engineers started with the gun, and then built an entire aircraft around it. That's not a weapon bolted onto a plane. That's a weapon that IS the plane. Because the gun is so massive, engineers had to do something unusual to make it accurate. They mounted it slightly off-center so that the single barrel that actually fires at any given moment sits perfectly on the aircraft's centerline. That way, when it fires, the recoil pushes straight back through the spine of the jet instead of yanking it sideways. The result is that 8 out of every 10 shells land inside a 40-foot circle from 4,000 feet away. And here's the detail that everyone notices when they look at an A-10 for the first time: the nose wheel sits noticeably to the right instead of dead center. That's not an accident or a design flaw. The wheel had to move out of the way to make room for the gun. The aircraft literally reorganized itself to accommodate the weapon. The ammunition belt mixes armor-piercing rounds with high-explosive ones. The armor-piercing shells use an extremely hard core to punch through several inches of tank armor at combat distances. The high-explosive rounds rip through thinner targets and detonate fuel and ammunition inside. When an armored vehicle gets caught in the open by this thing, it's not a fair fight. But raw firepower alone was never going to be enough. Because this jet was going to fly low, slow, and directly into the most dangerous airspace imaginable, and it needed to survive it. And what the engineers built to do that is one of the most remarkable things about this aircraft: the flying tank. The people who designed the A-10 had a simple philosophy: this aircraft is going to get hit, so make it survive getting hit. The pilot sits inside a titanium shell called the bathtub, armor plates about 1.5 inches thick that wrap entirely around the cockpit. This shell alone weighs around 1,200 pounds. It's designed to stop direct hits from 23mm high-explosive shells, the kind of heavy anti-aircraft fire that would tear most other jets apart on contact. But the survivability goes well beyond the cockpit armor. The two engines are placed on the back of the fuselage, high up, separated from each other and away from the wings. If a missile takes out one engine, the blast is far less likely to destroy the other at the same time. The jet can fly home on one engine. The hydraulic flight control systems are duplicated and run along separate paths through the aircraft. But here's the truly remarkable part: if all the hydraulics fail completely, the pilot can still fly the plane. There's a full mechanical backup system using cables and pulleys, like something out of World War II engineering, that allows control of the main surfaces even if every drop of fluid has leaked out. The fuel tanks are packed with foam blocks to reduce the risk of fire or explosion if they're punctured. Valves can seal off damaged sections mid-flight to stop the fuel from draining away. The tanks sit close to the center of the jet, away from the vulnerable wingtips. And then there's the landing gear detail that almost sounds too specific to be intentional. Even when the gear is retracted and tucked up into the body, a small portion of the main wheel still sticks out below the fuselage. On purpose. If the landing gear is damaged and won't deploy, those partial wheels absorb the first impact of a belly landing and keep the airframe from tearing itself apart on the runway. The A-10 was designed to keep flying with pieces missing. And in combat, that's exactly what it did, returning to base with holes in wings, shredded tail sections, and blown-out engine nacelles, while other jets would have already become wreckage on the ground. That toughness earned it a legendary reputation. But when the digital age arrived, the Warthog had a new problem: its brain hadn't kept up with its brawn. And fixing that is what transformed it from a tough old relic into something genuinely frightening. Giving the beast a brain. By the early 2000s, a Warthog pilot flying into combat still had round analog gauges in the cockpit, paper maps strapped to their knee, and targeting systems that amounted to their own two eyes. For close air support in the Middle East, that wasn't going to cut it anymore. The upgrade program that followed, turning the older A-10A into the A-10C, was less of a renovation and more of a complete internal transplant. Two large color screens replaced most of the old gauges and connected to a digital moving map. Friendly positions, target zones, and threat areas appeared as clear symbols instead of hand-drawn scribbles on a paper map that might have been outdated 3 hours ago. The weapons computer tracked exactly what was loaded on each wing station and how much remained. It sounds simple, but in the middle of a low-altitude gun run with anti-aircraft fire coming up at you, the difference between searching across 20 gauges and reading one organized screen is the difference between hitting the right target and not coming home. The controls were redesigned with something called hands-on throttle and stick, a layout that puts all the critical switches and thumb controls directly on the stick and throttle itself. The pilot can change weapons, slew sensors, and mark coordinates without ever letting go of the aircraft controls. Every second that a pilot doesn't have to look down at a console is a second they're looking outside where the threats actually are. Then came the targeting pods, long sensor packages that bolted under the wing and gave pilots an entirely new set of eyes. The pod carries a daylight camera, an infrared sensor that turns heat signatures into a crystal clear picture at night or through smoke, and a laser to precisely mark targets. Before these pods, an A-10 pilot often had to dive down to visually identify targets with the naked eye in haze and dust. With the pod feeding live video directly to the cockpit screen, the pilot can now scan from a much safer altitude, lock onto a single moving vehicle, and watch it in real time while the weapons computer calculates exact coordinates. And then they added the helmet. A system called Scorpion puts a small transparent display in front of one eye on the pilot's visor. Aircraft data and targeting cues float in the pilot's field of view, overlaid on the real world. If the pilot spots something suspicious on the ground and turns their head toward it, they can press a switch and the targeting pod automatically rotates to look at exactly the same point. If a missile is launched at the aircraft, a bright cue on the helmet tells the pilot which direction it's coming from, so they can react with a defensive turn before they've even found the right gauge to look at. A jet that already couldn't be killed very easily just became dramatically harder to fool. But the upgrades didn't stop with sensors and cockpit displays. What happened to the weapons this aircraft could carry is where things got genuinely terrifying. The arsenal that nobody expected. The A-10 was always known for its gun, but the upgraded version turned into something that can essentially fight a war by itself, and do it more cheaply than almost anything else in the American inventory. The big change was smart bombs. The Joint Direct Attack Munition, better known as JDAM, is a guidance kit that bolts onto the back of a regular freefall bomb and adds a GPS receiver, a small computer, and steering fins. Now a bomb that used to need perfect weather and a visual run-in to have any accuracy can be released from medium altitude and cloud cover through smoke and still guide itself to a precise set of coordinates. For the A-10C, this meant carrying the 2,000-pound class GBU-31 for hitting bunkers and reinforced buildings, or the 500-pound GBU-38 for smaller, more precise targets, all without having to dive into anti-aircraft fire to make a visual pass. Release the bomb, turn away, and let the physics and software handle the rest. Then they added the small diameter bomb, a slim, winged weapon in the 250-pound class that can glide more than 40 miles from its release point using a combination of satellite and internal guidance. Because it's smaller and lighter, a single weapons rack can carry 4 of them in the space where one large bomb used to hang. A fully loaded A-10 with these new racks can carry up to 16 of these weapons at once, each pre-programmed to a different target coordinate, and hit 16 separate locations in a single pass. And then there's the weapon that might tell you the most about what makes the Warthog special, a modified rocket called the APKWS, the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System. For decades, aircraft fired unguided 2.75-inch rockets that flew in a straight line and hit whatever they happened to hit. The APKWS is a small guidance section that slides between the existing rocket body and its warhead, adds small steering fins, and gives the rocket a laser seeker. In testing, APKWS rounds fired from an A-10 hit within inches of the aim point every time. One shot of this weapon costs a fraction of a full guided missile. The warhead is small enough that you can hit a single vehicle or a gun position without destroying everything within a city block. When friendly soldiers are 200 meters away, that precision is worth more than all the power in the world. This combination, big guns, precision bombs, cheap guided rockets, and targeting pods, turned the A-10 into something the Air Force itself didn't fully expect, an aircraft that could take on complex, distributed targets across a massive area, all on a budget that made the alternatives look embarrassing. And that budget argument is exactly why what happened in Washington is so fascinating, because the people with the money kept trying to get rid of it, and the people doing the fighting kept bringing it back. The fight Washington couldn't win. Here is a number, $11,500. That's roughly what it costs to fly an A-10C for 1 hour. Here is another number, $32,000. That's approximately what 1 hour in an F-35A costs. When the target is a pickup truck carrying fighters, or a small mortar team dug into a hillside near friendly soldiers, the math becomes very uncomfortable for the people who want to get rid of the Warthog. The Air Force first tried to retire all the A-10s in 1984, the same year production ended. Congress blocked it. They tried again and again across multiple decades. Each time, lawmakers looked at the combat record and said no. In 2025, the Air Force proposed a 1-year phase-out of the entire remaining fleet of roughly 162 jets. Congress said no again, passing language requiring the Air Force to maintain more than 100 aircraft. The Air Force's argument isn't crazy. Senior leaders look at the future and see potential conflicts with adversaries who have dense, layered air defense networks, the kind of environment where a slow, non-stealthy jet flying at low altitude would be extremely vulnerable. They want the money and the pilots shifted to F-35s, F-15ES, and the new F-47. On paper, that's a coherent strategy for preparing for the highest-end fight imaginable. The problem is that the highest-end fight isn't the only fight happening. When the campaign against the Islamic State began in 2014, the Air Force had a full ramp of modern jets available. It still reached for the Warthog again and again. At certain points in that campaign, A-10s were flying roughly 1 in every 10 Air Force strike missions, and one of the A-10 squadrons flying out of Turkey was handling around 1% of all coalition close air support missions in the region, a staggering share for a single aircraft type that was supposed to be nearly obsolete. And then in late 2025, when U.S. forces struck Islamic State targets in Syria under a new operation, the Warthog was in the strike package again. Stealth fighters were available. Bombers were in the region. Drones were overhead. Commanders still chose to send the aircraft designed in the 1970s. In April 2026, the Air Force Secretary announced on social media that the Warthog would be extended through 2030. The first time in over a decade the service wasn't actively trying to kill the program. The announcement came just days after an A-10 had been flying combat missions over Iran as part of Operation Epic Fury. One was even lost during a mission to help rescue crew members of a downed F-15, the damaged Warthog flying all the way to friendly airspace over Kuwait before the pilot safely ejected. It survived long enough for the pilot to get out. Of course it did, but there's a harder question lurking behind all of this. The Warthog keeps winning the budget argument because there's nothing quite like it. And the uncomfortable truth about why that is, why no replacement has appeared, is something the Air Force doesn't love talking about. Why nothing can replace it. After the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan made clear that the Warthog's job wasn't going away, the Air Force ran a serious experiment to find a cheaper alternative. They flew armed turboprop planes, the A-29 Super Tucano and the A-6 Wolverine, over desert ranges, trying to find something with low operating costs and modern sensors that could handle many of the A-10's missions in lower threat environments. Neither aircraft stepped fully into the role. The reason is hard to pin on any single thing. Part of it is the titanium bathtub and the redundant systems. No other jet offers that level of survivability against the guns and small missiles that ground forces actually face in real combat. Part of it is the loiter time. The A-10 can circle over a battle area for a long time, watching, waiting, and responding faster than a faster aircraft that burns fuel at a higher rate. Part of it is the gun itself, which has no equivalent on any other aircraft in any other country's inventory. And part of it is trust. Ground troops who call in close air support don't just want firepower. They want an aircraft they can count on to stay overhead, to understand the fight below, and to hit the right target when the margin between a saved life and a catastrophe is 50 feet of distance. The Warthog has spent 40 years earning that trust, mission by mission, war by war. Ukraine tried to acquire the aircraft early in the Russian war, believing the tank-killing reputation was exactly what they needed. U.S. officials and eventually the Ukrainians themselves cooled on the idea. Russia's air defense network made low, slow flight extremely dangerous. The Warthog's vulnerability in a sky thick with modern surface-to-air missiles is real, and the Air Force leadership isn't wrong to think about that future. But that vulnerability doesn't erase the enormous gap that retiring this aircraft would leave in every other kind of fight, the kinds of fights that have actually been happening, not just the war scenario that looks best in a briefing room slide deck. The A-10 was supposed to be a stopgap, a Cold War niche aircraft that would fade away once the Soviet tank columns never came. Instead, it outlasted the Soviet Union, outlasted every attempt to retire it, outlasted entire generations of supposedly superior replacement aircraft, and is still flying combat missions today at over 43 years old.